All right. All good? Right. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about the Russian intelligence services and the history of the Russian intelligence services. Always a popular topic, often comes up because Russia is responsible for a lot of cybercrime going on in the world and cyber espionage. And this is a talk about where does it all come from? Where do these attacks actually begin? So we're going to just go through the talk contents. We're going to go through where did it come from? What have they done? How does it all work? And how is it all interconnected together? And a little bit more info about the Russian intelligence services in general, because you may have heard of Fancy Bear or Cozy Bear, but that's just the name. You don't actually know the agency that they're a part of. You don't actually understand the goals and objectives of those agencies or anything like that, or why they do the things that they do. So there's a little bit more diving into how that works with this talk. And it's not a super long talk, so should be fun, should be interesting, and we can just dive straight into it. So Russia, am I right? They are known for a lot of things, a lot of interesting things. I mean, yeah, there's all sorts of interesting stuff going on in Russia. Kind of a crazy country for many reasons, but their intelligence services and their cybercrime gangs are, pretty much as expected, as you can see on the slide here. So where does it all start? Well, you could probably potentially tie it all back to, if you go back 100, 150 years ago, back to the Tsarist times, when you have the Tsars Okhrana. These are like the Tsar of Russia, his main sort of secret police force. They would take down anyone who's trying to plan an assassination against the Tsar or disrupt his businesses, that kind of work. That's what these guys did. They were very much the sort of internal sort of MI5 counterterrorism kind of group back in the day, back 150 years ago. So that's sort of where a lot of the tradecraft is kind of developed from, all the way back to these guys. And then it kind of develops a little bit more into the Russian Revolution, 1917, the October siege of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And then it kind of spread out on the rest of Russia there and became a communist country. Right in the middle of World War One. Good thing to note as well. But yeah, this is where Lenin was kind of consolidating his power after the Russian Revolution. He'd actually, overthrown the Tsar, executed him and his family in the basement, and taken over as, supreme leader of Russia. And he created this agency called the Cheka, who were very much his, secret police and the type of group that was consolidating his power, like I said. They would interrogate people, they would torture people, anyone who tried to assassinate Lenin, anyone who was trying to overthrow the government. These were his soldiers, these were his enforcers, so to speak. And they kind of graduate in 1934 when Lenin dies and Stalin takes over. Stalin, as we all know, the big man with the mustache, actually from Georgia, not from Russia, but he actually set up another intelligence agency called the NKVD, which is, again, it's like a prestige version of the Cheka, and it's like Prestige 3. They've taken over from each level, and now they've evolved into the NKVD. Very, very nasty guys, they're kind of famous for driving around Moscow and arresting people and capturing them and torturing them. Very, very nasty guys, and they did a lot of intelligence work as well, but they were more like a very brutal group, really. And then they graduate again to Khrushchev's KGB, which is another form of the Russian intelligence. And they were kind of doing more foreign intelligence operations and things. They were kind of infiltrating organizations and governments around the world. This is like the peak of the Cold War, which was, post World War II. Russia and the US are kind of fighting over East and West Germany. You've got all sorts of wars and things and revolutions sparking up and around the world. You've got the Chinese Revolution. Vietnam was about to become a communist country as well. The Korean War as well. KGB were very much trying to help the spread of communism around the world. Probably one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the entire world after the Americans and things. So, and then, as we all know, in 1991, Swan Lake was playing on the TVs, right? the Soviet Union, the USSR had collapsed, or the government had been overthrown, and this whole history of communist intelligence agencies, it was over. And now we get into the more interesting Russian Federation kind of stuff. We see a lot more foreign-related intelligence campaigns. We see Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin sort of bring up the FSB or the FSB, which is which is their version of the NKV and the Cheka and things. And this organization is very much foreign intelligence agency as much as it is a domestic surveillance kind of organization as well. And then you also have the SVR, which is the primary foreign intelligence group that performs. It's sort of like the equivalent of the US CIA. These are the guys that actually go into governments around the world and try to sway them, try to gain political intelligence, and try to gain persistence in these organizations and feed it all back to Russia and the Russian government for decision making. The other interesting thing is you have kind of a parallel intelligence kind of unit, which is made up of the Russian military. You have the Russian military intelligence, or the main directorate of the armed forces, or whatever you want to call them, also known as the GRU. And then you also have the Spetsnaz GRU, which is kind of like their SAS, SBS kind of group as well. Nasty guys, you don't want to see them on the battlefield. The other interesting thing to think about with the sort of apparatus of the Russian intelligence services and agencies is the private sector organizations. Anyone here put your hand up if you use Telegram? How do you keep your hand up if you knew it was run by Russians? And you continue to use it because it's run by Russians. The guy who created Telegram is also the creator of vContact, which is like Russian Facebook. They created these messaging apps and social media platforms because they don't want to rely on American social media apps and things, right? And of course, maybe no other countries as well. And thinking to more the audience that we gathered here today, we've got the cybersecurity people, we've got software engineers. Don't go and work for Kaspersky or Group IB because they do some really cool research and really awesome things. If you do end up going to work for one, you're very much going to be associated with Russian intelligence services because that's where the founders come from. The people who run the company have their families in Russia. Basically, and essentially, they are compromised in a way that the Russian government has control over them. Even if they aren't, super patriotic towards Russia, they are just inherently compromised by their families being there. So my advice to you, the one thing you learned today is don't go and work for a Russian cybersecurity company. And then you have the telecommunications organizations as well. You have Vimpelcom and Rostelecom. These are the main backbone ISP tier 2 and 3 ISP organizations that actually handle the just general bandwidth and broadband flowing across from users to enterprises in and out of Russia as well. However, the intelligence agencies are in bed with them as well, and they actually have full control over, and they've even recently passed a law where they can just completely prohibit and delete content at any time passing over Russian internet cables as well, right? And then you have the sort of the state-run, state-owned media organizations. You have RT, Russia Today, and TASS. Very notably and interestingly, at the start of the Ukraine war, the US and UK governments actually banned RT having live TV channels because they were just completely spewing out disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Just whatever the Russian government told them to publish, they were just publishing it. So that's why we kind of banned them. And if you really, really want to go and read and watch that stuff, you can find it on the internet somewhere. But I think overall it's a good idea to just stop a direct inject into the local population. And that takes me on to the Russian cyber operation groups. So as I mentioned before, you have the SVR, you have the FSB, you have the GRU, you have, as well as these intelligence agencies, the main three, you also have hacktivist groups and the fakedivist groups, which are kind of is an interesting idea of a group that proclaims and pretends to be a hacktivist group and runs a Telegram channel and announces all their DDoS and hack and leak attacks, but actually some of that information is passed to them by the intelligence agencies, by these guys. So they're kind of known as faketivists. Another good detailed diagram developed by Joe Slowick, who put together a well-organized flowchart of all the well-known Russian APT groups that you may have seen them reporting or heard about, and linked them back to the agencies. So if we think we have the FSB, we have the 16th and 18th intelligence centers, and then we actually have the names that you may have heard of. So we have Turler, Berserk Bear, the Yahoo hack team, and the Gamma Radon group. Each of these APT groups that launched the spear phishing attacks, the device exploitation, the intrusion campaigns, the malware deployment, they actually are all linked back to sub-agencies and centers of the main three intelligence agencies that I was talking about earlier. So if you want to learn more about that, I recommend checking this out and seeing some more research from Joe Slowick as well. Moving swiftly on, we can go to the major Russian cyber espionage operations. So again, the reason some of you may have actually ever heard of the Russian agencies is some of these big attacks that take place. And some of the most notable ones that sort of kicked a lot of this off was, if you think back to 2013 and 2015, when global headlines were made that this major news organization, TV5 Le Monde, which is the main French news channel, had all their websites defaced and taken down, actually pretending to be by ISIS, I believe, which is kind of interesting because it was at a time when there was these terrorist attacks attacking France and things. We had explosives and mass shootings and things. So it was pretty interesting to see a Russian cyber operation trying to leverage some of that by targeting France as well. And it comes back to these, why do the Russian intelligence services do these kinds of attacks? And why do they pick certain targets? You have the 2016 DNC hack. You had this was at the peak US election when you had Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was the Democrats. The Russian SVR and the GRU both infiltrated Hillary Clinton's organization, the DNC, and was able to basically steal emails and files and started publishing them through WikiLeaks, through a persona known as Guccifer 2.0. And it's a very interesting combination, probably one of the most famous Russian espionage and influence operations, a combination of espionage intrusion campaign followed by a data leak and influence operation. And this was kind of set off a kind of a chain reaction of many different types of these campaigns. Once you figure out how they do one operation, you can kind of get a feel for how they like to operate, and you can get a feel for whether something's likely to be them or not. That's sort of, because I've been researching and studying these groups and campaigns for so long, I can pretty much hear about an attack that's gone on and be like, oh, okay, that reminds me of one of these, right? So that makes me think about who is most likely to do it. And then it's just more case of gathering evidence to try and prove that hypothesis as an intelligence analyst, right? If you think back to the shadow brokers, some people think it was most likely the FSB. So shadow brokers, again, each of these I could probably write a talk about, but each of these, with the shadow brokers, it was such a massive dump. Basically, a load of tools that had been developed by the NSA, the US National Security Agency, a lot of exploits and malware that had been developed by them, including 0 days for Windows, had basically been collected and stolen and then just dumped publicly on a website by the shadow brokers. And no one really knew who the shadow brokers really was, but they spoke in such a weird way and a weird language that it was kind of obviously a non-native English speaker. It wasn't a sort of insider threat. And then the kind of truth began to unravel that someone who was a contractor for the NSA had Kaspersky installed on their computer. And when they downloaded the exploits, it went up to the Kaspersky cloud. And then, the stories from there goes from there, right? If we have a think about the FBI Cyber Most Wanted, here's a list of all the Russians, soldiers and mercenaries and criminals and things who are all on the FBI Cyber Most Wanted. Each one, I basically, read and every single thing from these, every single story about each person on this Most Wanted list, and you kind of build up you can kind of break them down each one. You can figure out what type of attacks and what type of campaigns and what tactics, techniques, and procedures do they each use. And you can build a really good understanding of what each agency does, what cyber criminals like to do, and what are the types of characteristics of these guys. Good, interesting thing to note is there's actually no women here, but very, very recently, literally last week, there was a Russian woman who was sanctioned by the US Treasury for performing some of that hacktivist types of attacks as well, as part of the cyber army of Russia. Russian organized cybercrime. We may have heard of a lot of this stuff, of ransomware gangs taking down big companies. We've heard of the attack of Kaseya, which was a massive managed service provider, a software provider for managed service providers, and a Russian ransomware gang managed to get in, infiltrate, and deploy ransomware across 1,500 different companies. A really big attack, and it was kind of all linked back to this sort of Russia and actually Ukrainian-speaking gang known as Our Evil. A lot of the interesting things about these massive ransomware attacks and campaigns is that the criminals are kind of provided a safe haven. They may end up sanctioned, or they may end up on the most wanted list. They're making these millions and millions of dollars, but they're never arrested. They never go to prison, and that's because they're basically permitted by the government. One of these characters, Maxim Yakubets, he actually drives around Moscow in a massive painted and what's the word, wrapped Lamborghini. Drives around, drifting around. His videos that the NCA shared of him drifting around Red Square in his Lamborghini, because he's completely protected by the state. There's no one who's going to investigate him because he's married to the daughter of one of the FSB officers. So if your father-in-law is one of the commanders of the FSB, you're not going to get arrested by him, right? That's just how it works in Russia. Let's have a think about more recent times. In 2022, February 2022, Russia actually invaded Ukraine, full-scale land invasion, which is kind of an extension of the 2014 annexation of Crimea. But in between that time, in between the annexation of Crimea and the full-scale invasion, Russia was doing quite a lot of destructive cyber attacks against Ukraine. They were going in, infiltrating the energy systems, all sorts of critical infrastructure, government networks, banks, trains, supermarkets, whatever, and they were trying to just basically cause as much damage as they could to Ukraine. They were basically using Ukraine as a kind of a test bed, as kind of a sandbox to test their cyber weapons and just unleash hell on their government and critical infrastructure. So if you know anyone who's from Ukraine or has actually any cyber experience the last 10 years in Ukraine, buy them a drink and they'll tell you some of the most interesting cyber war stories ever, I assure you. Because if we think back to the Indestroyer attack of 2016, it was actually one of the first times industrial control system malware had been developed and successfully deployed against a power station to cause a blackout for hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians in the middle of winter. I think it might have even been Christmas Day that they did the attack. So pretty crazy stuff going on pre-invasion. The NotPetya wiper worm is another interesting one. 2017, remember I was talking about the shadow brokers and the exploits that were leaked by the NSA? Well, the Russians thought it was a good idea to take those exploits, use them in a ransomware wiper attack, and then go and hit all the Ukrainian governments by infiltrating a tax software and then launching basically a malicious software update supply chain attack against all the government's networks that were using this Ukrainian tax software. And then it kind of just spread globally because you had all these companies with subsidiaries in Ukraine, and once NotPetya had been delivered via the malicious update, it was spreading into the main networks of these massive multinational companies. So you had companies like Maersk, and FedEx all had their entire global networks deleted by NotPetya, basically. Lots of interesting stuff going on in this time period. One of the GRU groups that everyone kind of likes to focus on is a group known as Sandworm, also known as GRU Unit 74455, is kind of how they've been attributed to a Russian military group who was launching spear phishing campaigns against a lot of the targets that Russia was most interested in at the time. So you had sort of anti-corruption groups who were looking at Russian oligarchs. You had the Sergei Skripal investigation in 2018, which was launched by Russian GRU operatives delivering Novichok in Salisbury, if you can remember that. And then you have all sorts of other interesting topics that they were and individuals they were trying to spearfish, and it was very revealing of what Russia's interests and things were of, if you actually tie back to who they were trying to spearfish. But then we hit 2022 and all hell breaks loose. We have some of the craziest cyber attacks happen. A lot of it underreported. But on the night of the invasion, the 28th of February, you had Viasat, which is one of the biggest satellite providers in Europe, had all their satellite modems across Eastern Europe all taken offline by a wiper. And again, this didn't just this did massively affect Ukraine. The Ukrainian military relied on these satellite comms. But it also spilled over into Romania, Germany, Poland. You have all these neighboring countries that relied on these satellite modems, and you had entire networks and systems being taken offline. And it just kind of spiraled out of control from there. We had wipers being deployed on government networks. Imagine you're the Ministry of Finance, you go into your office, multiple levels of computers, and nothing's turning on, nothing works. You go to see if there's any data left, and it's all been overwritten with zeros. That's the type of attacks we're talking about. Big stuff going on. For the rest of the world, if you don't have a company or subsidiary or ties to Ukraine, it's still very, very interesting to actually see what activities are going on in Ukraine. You can actually figure out what are the latest attacker techniques and TTPs that are being deployed by sort of the intelligence services, and you can start to think about, are your defenses prepared for an attack like this? Because some of these TTPs that are being pioneered with this types of targeting, through the cyber war essentially going on in Ukraine at the time, a lot of those stuff are going to be adopted and used by cyber criminals eventually, Russian cyber criminals, right? So as soon as something like this goes on, whenever there's some sort of big theater of war, and you start to see APT groups getting involved and destructive cyber attacks getting involved, that's when you really want to be focusing on and trying to look at what's the latest TTPs being used. Because I'm certain that agencies kind of hone their techniques, they test them locally in their own networks, and they get ready to deploy them at some point, like Russia did. Again, just another overview of the GRU, the Russian GRU affiliated destructive cyber attacks. We had the Whispergate attack in January. So before the invasion even took place, they basically got a bit trigger happy, and they were already deploying destructive attacks against Ukrainian government entities. You had the Viasat attack, and then you had a few wiper attacks, and then you had Indestroyer 2. Not very inventive with the namings, but basically what they did was they developed ICS malware. They deployed it against an energy grid, electrical power station network, and they tried to take it down. But the interesting thing about this attack was the Ukrainians were smarter than them. They actually figured out this is exactly the type of thing they're going to do. They put the right detection systems in place, and they were able to stop Indestroyer 2. So a big win, big well done, and salute to the Ukrainian computer emergency response team for that one. That's not easy to do. And then the hacktivism surrounding Ukraine. This is kind of an interesting trigger point, kind of a flash point from when we saw an explosion of hacktivist activity surrounding a new war. When Russia began their invasion in 24th or 28th of February, you had all these groups declaring their allegiance for Russia. You had declaring their allegiance for Ukraine. You had the IT Army of Ukraine, which was actually a Telegram group, which has spun up of about 250,000 members almost overnight, had actually begun to crowdsource DDoS attacks against Russian government websites. But then on the Russian side, you had a lot of things like Killnet, Zacnet, and some other groups that, again, they were kind of doing the same thing on their side. They were crowdsourcing DDoS attacks against not just Ukrainian sites, because a lot of them just went just straight up went down in the first few weeks of the war. They started targeting sort of neighboring countries and countries that were providing military support and aid to Ukraine. Started DDoSing their government sites, civil services. Imagine you have some sort of issue where you want to talk to the government about log into their portal and upload your documents or whatever. All those kinds of things were being targeted and DDoS offline. So who knows how much real damage and destruction is being caused by this, because it's kind of incalculable when you think about it. But even though I may have made the Russian intelligence services sound really scary, they make a lot of trivial mistakes at times. They're pretty straightforward to understand. You can see them in your sites and you can understand them pretty well. They're not the most sophisticated threats, but they're pretty persistent and they're pretty motivated to do what they do. But they do make mistakes, and those mistakes are exploited. I think 5 or 6 years ago, the Dutch intelligence services actually managed to hack the CCTV system of the SVR. They actually managed to get into the offices, the CCTV system of the office that the SVR operators were working in, and you could see them actually hacking. And that's pretty good proof that we know they are the guys doing what they do, right? And then also the Ukrainians. This is kind of a sad story in a way that after Russia had annexed Crimea, you still had Ukrainian security service officers working in Crimea. They basically defected and were flipped by the FSB, and they were basically tasked to then spearfish and contact their colleagues in the old department. And that's kind of like how these guys became de-anonymized, because the Ukrainians guys were like, oh, I know that guy, I used to work with him. Right? I recognize his voice on the phone. I recognize his, the way he signs off his emails or something. Pretty straightforward de-anonymization, but pretty hard stuff. Domestic surveillance in Russia. This is kind of coming towards the end of the talk, but this is kind of a big point and a big thing to think about, is the way that Russia's going. They're very isolationist, they're very nationalist, they're very excluding of other countries. They're turning into a bit of a North Korea. And the way to actually maintain control like Putin does, you have to have access to every bit of communication passing in and out of the country. So they've created an agency called, the Ministry of Digital Development, blah, 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 blah. But Roskomnadzor is the agency that has been developing a lot of this, banning VPNs, banning VoIP. You can't own too many SIM cards. If you have a certain number of followers, you have to register your identity with the Russian government now. Like, it's becoming a super monitored surveillance state. And I know the last talk was on Monero, but no joke, if you really wanted to evade some of this stuff, then you would that's probably why Monero is so popular in Russia, because they're trying to evade some of this stuff, right? And then you have the FSB. The FSB has actually developed their own system called SORM. And SORM stands for something in Russian, but essentially it's an agency that deploys the little black boxes in all the ISPs, internet service providers in Russia. And they collect all the evidence, all the intelligence, and they use that to arrest people, spy on people, whatever you want. Protect the state, protect Putin from the threats, right? Pretty interesting stuff, and it's had several iterations. They can tap phone calls, they can decrypt messages. It's like deep packet inspection on a countrywide scale, right? It's like the Russian Great Firewall in a way. Yeah, Russian censorship ramps up in 2024. This year has actually seen even more of this type of activity going on. We've seen the Russian organizers of Wikipedia have basically scrapped continuing to develop on it and started their own one called RuWiki. And they start to rewrite history, basically. They start to say, oh yeah, Stalin never purged thousands of officers during, the Cold War and things, or the Second World War. Russia's not responsible for the invasion of Ukraine. It was NATO's fault. That's this kind of stuff. They're basically rewriting history and then banning Wikipedia. And they're also starting to get rid of things like YouTube. They've created their own version called Platformer, which is developed by Russia today. You've got all sorts of VPN services and VoIP services being banned, like I mentioned. It's really getting super authoritarian There's not really many more steps you can go past this other than just banning the internet straight up. But where do we go from here? It's pretty tricky to say exactly when, like, is Russia going to be unsanctioned? Are they going to stop their invasion of Ukraine? It just seems like it's going on and on and on for the next, 5-10 years. It's pretty hard to say when it's actually going to end. But whilst they're kind of dealing with that for the foreseeable future, they are interestingly building up their allegiances and alliances with countries such as China, Vietnam, India, countries across Africa, Iran, North Korea. North Korea is one of Russia's biggest weapons suppliers at the moment. It's pretty interesting to see how they're building up this basically anti-NATO organization, which is essentially BRICS, right? It's the, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa allegiance that is kind of countering NATO in a way, evading sanctions. All the countries that basically are sanctioned have gotten together and created their own little allegiance. I mean, it was bound to happen eventually. But yeah, it's pretty interesting to see that development as well, as the world is kind of splitting into two, with Russia kind of leading the charge on the other side. And kind of, I'll leave you, I think this is the second to last slide, but I'll leave you with this. Very interestingly, the world, the entire 95% of the internet is sort of spread around the world using undersea cables. And the Russians have developed a complete research vessel and submersible deep sea submersible program to basically investigate and take down those cables at any time they want, either by dragging the anchors across the bottom of the sea, and also tapping the cables and surveilling people and surveilling countries and things that way as well. So that's potentially the way we're going to start seeing things. I reckon we could potentially start seeing a lot of this cable cutting activity going up. And they're still not really connected to the global financial system. They are booted off SWIFT, and they're pretty isolated at the moment. So if they wanted to cause disruption for us, that's the type of, the subsea cables and the global financial system are the two things they could really take down to disrupt, their opposition at the moment. So yeah, not the most fun and interesting stuff, a little bit scary, but I hope you enjoyed, hope you understood, I hope you've got them in your sights. And these are the adversaries. I want you guys to all go out and hunt them down. But that's it. Thank you very much.